Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Free Press Live. I'm your host, Michael Moynihan. Actually, I'm one of your hosts, Michael Moynihan. We'll get to the other hosts in a second. But I assume you're staring at your computer saying, Michael, have I not seen the previous episodes of the Free Press Live? No, you haven't, because this is the first one. And this is our maiden voyage. And we have a bazillion amazing guests coming up. But this time we said, let's keep it in-house. So joining me today, opinion editor for Newsweek and a Free Press columnist. Am I right? You're a columnist, Batya Ungar-Sargon, our friend, my favorite sparring partner, and she might be a communist. Also, podcast host of Conversations with Coleman. It's exactly what it says. They're conversations with the great Coleman Hughes, Free Press contributor but we also have the Free Press reporter, up-and-coming star, Canadian, Rupa, I'm sorry. I got caught on Canadian, Rupa. I feel like I should tell everyone that, because when they talk, you're like, oh, what's going on? She's Canadian. Rupa Subramanya is here too. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on our maiden voyage. So what are we to discuss tonight? Batya, we have a bazillion stories to discuss, but we're going to compress it, okay, to these four. The top four here. Tim Kaine. I think you might be arguing this one for us, Batya. Maybe he's a phony. Maybe he is guilty of stolen valor. We don't know. Okay. How is Kamala Harris handling her left flank here? I mean, this is a conversation about Tim Walz and why she didn't pick Josh Shapiro. And something I don't understand, I'm going to sit this one out. There's a gender controversy at the Paris Olympics. Always advisable not to get involved in these things, and I don't understand it, but everyone's going to explain it to me. And then a little bit of future gazing of what is going on in the UK. Good Lord, full of riots, two sides out in the street. It looks like a civil war, which is what Elon Musk thinks it is, but it's probably not. So, Batya, what the hell's going on with Tim Walz?
Right. So Kamala Harris's VP pick, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, is being touted as this, folksy Midwestern high school teacher and football coach who served valiantly in the military. So on paper, he seems like exactly the kind of guy who's like tailor-made to appeal to the heartland. But there are some holes emerging in his backstory, specifically when it comes to his military service. So Walz served 24 years in the National Guard. And back in 2018, while he was arguing for gun control, he invoked the weapons of war that he carried to make the case for gun laws. Take a look.
Kick in the butt for the NRA. I spent 25 years in the Army and I hunt. And I gave the money back, and I'll tell you what I have been doing. I've been voting for common sense legislation that protects the Second Amendment, but we can do background checks. We can do CDC research. We can make sure we don't have reciprocal carry among states, and we can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at.
A stirring speech. The only problem is Walz never deployed to Iraq. He retired in 2005, just after his unit got their deployment order. And now a number of veterans are coming out and accusing Walz of stolen valor. A member of Walz's own battalion went on Fox News to have his say. Take a look at that.
We're mad because we all did what we were supposed to do. We did the right thing, and it's dishonorable what he did. He left somebody else up to take over his spot. He just ditched us.
Why do you think Walz ditched you?
I believe my idea is he probably knew he wasn't a good leader and he wanted to do something else. And what we did get a really good leader with Command Sergeant Barnes, and he saved a lot of lives over there. He led squads.
So Coleman, let's start with you. How big of a crime is it to pad your resume while you're running for office? Do you agree that this is stolen valor, that this is resume padding? What's your take on this whole brouhaha?
Well, for a politician, it's a minor and common crime. For a normal person, it would make you seem crazy. Unfortunately, so many of our politicians do this kind of thing. Joe Biden used to say that he got arrested trying to see Nelson Mandela in prison, which was just a total fabrication. The truth ended up being that like some guards made him move like 10 feet to the left to go through the whites only door. And that somehow morphed into getting arrested to see Mandela. Hillary talked about, arriving in Bosnia under gunfire. Biden, again, used to say he graduated at the top of his class on a full scholarship, like all total fabrications. So, I mean, there's something about so many of these politicians that they just have this tendency to pad the resume and lie about their biography. And, my theory is that they lie about the things that they're most insecure about. So like Biden, his intelligence, where he graduated in his law school, hint not very high. And, with Tim Walz, it may be that he's a little insecure about that he actually didn't serve in Iraq. And so that's exactly the area he wants to pad.
It's a very interesting point. Rupa, there was another comment by Walz that was circulating on the right in which he said that there was no free speech right to misinformation. Let's watch that clip, actually.
We need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
So, Rupa, you've been amazing in your reporting on these issues. What's your take on that? How worried should we be about this Walz character?
Well, on hate speech, Walz is just completely wrong when he says there's no guarantee to free speech when it comes to hate speech, because we know SCOTUS is very, very clear about this. There is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. It protects views that would be considered hateful. On misinformation, however, I happen to be a free speech absolutist, and I consider false information as abhorrent as it is to be free speech. And as well, the best antidote to misinformation is actually more information. But having said that, misinformation, as in spreading libel and making false statements, for example, you lie when you're under oath or being investigated by the government, these are obviously punishable by law. Now, Walz seems to be talking about a certain kind of election misinformation as it relates to spreading false information about election voting procedures, for example. And I believe we already have statutes in a number of states that prohibit such false statements. Now, Batya, how worried should we be? I think the problem is that the context, to borrow a commonly used word from Kamala Harris, the problem is now we live in a world where even in the United States, with some of the strongest constitutional protections to free speech, the right to free expression has been under attack lately. We saw that during the pandemic, for example, when dissenting views were censored. In September 2023, let's remember, a federal court actually ruled that the Biden administration had violated the First Amendment when they coerced or significantly encouraged social media platforms to moderate content during the pandemic. Here is a disturbing data point that I would like to leave you with. A 2023 Pew survey found that 42% of voters agreed that freedom of information should be protected, even if it means false information can be published. So that's where we're at. And I think we should be worried because the trend is not very encouraging.
Michael, we talked a lot about the sort of do no harm principle, right? In picking a VP, has Walz met that barrier, or is Kamala Harris going to have a problem on her hands?
I'm going to be a little heterodox here and say that I think so far he has. I think a lot of this stuff is really reaching. Look, one of the things I noticed about the weapons of war that I carried in war, that could have been someone misspeaking, because weapons of war that I carried in war might be just the cadence, what you would expect for people like that. With a lot of history of this, I mean, there's books about stolen valor. And by the way, on free speech, you should be allowed to lie about this stuff. Congress should not be involved in this. And this has been a problem, and nobody points this out. That is actually a free speech issue, to lie about being in the military. But the interesting thing about this is we don't have a lot of examples of him saying this other times. If that were the case, and you have the guy that comes on Jesse Waters' show, and it's very much a swift boat Veterans for Truth, if people remember this, in 2004 when John Kerry ran. And look, that was also misguided, because the thing about John Kerry to point out was that he threw his medals away. He came and denounced his fellow soldiers in front of Congress and said they were baby killers, etc., that kind of language. And they got bogged down and people didn't like him, right? What we're getting back from the campaign is that, look, he bailed out before he knew he was being deployed. He said he was going to run for office. I don't find that too alienating as a voter, because the guy did spend 24 years in the National Guard. I mean, it's a very dangerous thing for a campaign to attack somebody's military service, particularly when they serve for 24 years. It's just not a great strategy. What you should attack is what Rupa was talking about. that people saying things like that is increasingly common in our world to suggest that there is such a thing as hate speech. I think where this comes from is people think there's hate crime. They know that there are hate crimes, which I think are also a debatable proposition, that there must be also hate speech. I mean, there is no criminal statute for hate speech. Misinformation should be allowed, considering what we hear that is misinformation itself turns out to be misinformation oftentimes. And this is just a political cudgel to beat people with. But I think it is following this very, very bad trend, as Rupa does point out, away from the idea of free speech, particularly amongst young people.
Coleman, I wanted to ask you about the aesthetics here of Walz and this idea of the Democrats wanting somebody with this military background. You know, he's coming out with the camo hat that they're now marketing. You know, the Democrats seem to be trying to reclaim the aesthetics of the heartland and the values even of patriotism, dare we hope. Is this something that we should be excited about? I mean, is this something that signals their own sort of like having reached the apex of their, you know, anti-military, anti-patriotic vibes or whatever? Is this a vibe shift?
I don't think so. I mean, I think every presidential candidate, every Democrat, the past three at least, have tried to choose a VP that is demographically and kind of sociologically different from them. You know, both like Obama picked Biden for the same reason. I think that Kamala picked Tim Walz because he has a vibe that is Midwestern, a vibe that's familiar to people who know a lot of people in the military, a vibe that's familiar to a lot of people that grow up in rural areas. Now, the question is, like, does that actually translate into appealing to those voters? I don't think Tim Walz has actually done better with those voters than Biden did. So it may be that it's all only vibes at the end of the day, and it doesn't actually translate into any results. Moreover, I mean, we'll probably get to it later, but you know, his recent policy record is hardly appealing to that kind of voter. So it's really all vibes at this point. And though I agree, he does have the right vibes, I think you probably need more than just vibes in this case to show results.
Yeah, you know,
Vibes
I mean,
are not enough.
Vibes are not enough. I mean, look, you look at some of the numbers from his last election in Minnesota, and it doesn't look, as my pal Steve Kornacki pointed out, does not look like he's even shifting people within Minnesota on these issues. But, you know, he looks like the guy who's a football coach. He doesn't look like a kind of lefty radical guy. But, you know, he does come out there and say, well, socialism is just kind of being a good neighbor. That stuff doesn't fly.